The icy wind cut through General George Washington's weathered coat as he gazed across the Delaware River on the night of December 25, 1776. Behind him, the remnants of the Continental Army huddled around dying campfires, their spirits as frozen as the ground beneath their feet. The revolution teetered on the brink of collapse, and Washington knew that, without a miracle, the cause of American independence would die with the coming dawn. The year 1776 had begun with such promise. The Declaration of Independence had been signed in July, proclaiming to the world that 13 colonies would no longer bow to British tyranny. Yet by December, that bold proclamation seemed nothing more than parchment and ink. British General William Howe had methodically crushed American resistance across New York, forcing Washington's army into a desperate retreat across New Jersey. Thomas Paine's words echoed in Washington's mind. These are the times that try men's souls. Indeed, they were. His army had dwindled from 20,000 men to fewer than 3,000. Many soldiers' enlistments would expire at midnight on December 31st, just 6 days away. Without pay, without proper clothing, without hope. They would simply walk away from the revolution and return to their farms and families. The British forces, meanwhile, had settled into comfortable winter quarters throughout New Jersey. Hessian mercenaries occupied Trenton, while British regulars controlled Princeton and other strategic towns. They believed the rebellion was effectively over, that Washington's ragtag army posed no serious threat during the harsh winter months. This confidence, Washington realized, might be their greatest weakness. Colonel Alexander Hamilton approached through the snow, his young face etched with concern. "General, the men are asking about our next move. Morale is ... challenging." Nodded grimly. He had been pondering the same question that plagued every Patriot leader. How could they strike a blow that would revive the revolution? The plan that formed in Washington's mind was audacious beyond measure. Rather than retreat further or wait for spring, he would launch a surprise attack on the Hessian garrison at Trenton. The operation would require crossing the ice-choked Delaware River in the dead of winter, marching 9 miles through a blizzard, and attacking professional soldiers with his poorly equipped volunteers. Military textbooks would call it suicide, but Washington understood something that his enemies did not. Desperate times demanded desperate measures. The psychological impact of a victory, however small, could resurrect American morale and convince wavering patriots that the cause was not lost. More importantly, it might persuade his soldiers to extend their enlistments and continue fighting, as referenced in David Hackett Fisher's acclaimed work Washington's Crossing. The general spent the evening of December 25th consulting with his most trusted officers, Colonel John Glover, whose Massachusetts mariners would handle the treacherous river crossing, studied the ice floes with the eye of an experienced seaman. General Nathaniel Greene and General John Sullivan would lead separate columns in the assault, while Washington himself would accompany the main force. The password for the operation would be victory or death, words that perfectly captured the stark choice facing the Continental Army. There would be no retreat from Trenton. They would either win a decisive victory or perish in the attempt. As Washington prepared his men for what many believed would be their final battle, he carried with him the weight of a nation's hopes and the knowledge that the next 48 hours would determine whether the American experiment in self-governance would survive its first winter. The sleet began falling at sunset on December 25th, turning the world into a crystalline nightmare of ice and wind. Washington stood at McConkey's Ferry, watching his men prepare the Durham boats that would carry them across the Delaware River. Each vessel, now designed for hauling iron ore, could hold 25 to 30 soldiers, but navigating the ice-choked waters would test even Colonel Glover's experienced mariners to their limits. Captain William Washington, the general's cousin, supervised the loading of artillery pieces under the direction of Captain Alexander Hamilton and Lieutenant James Monroe. The 18 cannons, though few in number, would prove crucial in the coming battle. Young Lieutenant Monroe, barely 18 years old, would later become the 5th President of the United States. But on this frozen night, he was simply another officer preparing for what seemed like certain death. The first boat pushed off at 6 o'clock in the evening. With Washington himself among the passengers, the general maintained his composure despite the deteriorating weather, knowing that his men watched his every expression for signs of doubt or fear. The crossing, planned to take 3 hours, stretched into a 9-hour ordeal as howling winds and floating ice transformed the Delaware into a frozen gauntlet. Private John Greenwood later wrote of the crossing, "The wind was so high that it seemed to go through our bones." Many soldiers lacked proper shoes, leaving bloody footprints in the snow as they marched to the embarkation point. Some men wrapped their feet in rags torn from their own clothing, while others left their feet bare, trusting that movement would keep frostbite at bay. Major General John Sullivan's division faced particular challenges as ice jams threatened to crush their boats against the rocky shore. The mariners from Marblehead, Massachusetts, veterans of countless North Atlantic storms, fought the river with oars and poles, their hands raw and bleeding from the cold. Without their expertise, the entire operation would have ended in the Delaware's dark waters by 3 o'clock in the morning on December 26th. The last boat had reached the New Jersey shore. Washington quickly reorganized his forces, knowing that daylight would soon expose their presence to Hessian patrols. The army was divided into 2 main columns. Greene's division would attack Trenton from the north, while Sullivan's men would strike from the west, cutting off potential escape routes. The 9-mile march to Trenton tested the Continental Army's endurance beyond all previous limits. The nor'easter that had complicated the river crossing now became a frozen hell of wind and ice. Men stumbled through snowdrifts, supporting wounded comrades who could no longer walk. Some soldiers collapsed from exhaustion and had to be carried by their companions, but remarkably, not a single man turned back. Washington rode among his troops, offering words of encouragement despite his own fatigue. He understood that leadership meant sharing every hardship with his men, and his presence in the ranks bolstered morale more than any speech could have accomplished. When soldiers began to leave bloody footprints in the snow, the general ordered a brief halt to allow men to wrap their feet in strips torn from blankets. Colonel Glover's regiment, having completed the river crossing, now served as scouts and advance guards. Their familiarity with harsh weather conditions made them invaluable as the army approached Trenton's outskirts. At Birmingham, New Jersey, Washington made a crucial decision that would determine the battle's outcome rather than attempting to surprise the Hessian garrison at dawn. He would attack immediately upon arrival, gambling that the storm would mask his approach until the last possible moment. Dawn broke gray and bitter over Trenton on December 26, 1976. As Colonel Johann Roell dismissed the latest reports of American activity with a wave of his hand. The Hessian commander, a veteran of European campaigns, had grown contemptuous of Washington's army during the past months of easy victories. "These country clowns cannot harm us," he declared to his officers, more concerned with nursing his hangover from Christmas celebrations than with defensive preparations. The Hessian garrison of nearly 1,500 professional soldiers had settled into the comfortable routines of winter quarters. Their morning patrols had been perfunctory. The howling storm seemed to guarantee that no sensible army would venture forth in such weather. This assumption would prove fatal as Washington's forces approached the town's northern and western edges shortly after 8 o'clock in the morning. Captain Thomas Forrest's Pennsylvania battery unlimbered their 6-pound cannons at the head of King Street, while Captain Alexander Hamilton positioned his New York battery to command Queen Street. The thunder of artillery announced the American attack as iron balls crashed into Hessian barracks and scattered groups of confused soldiers who stumbled into the streets still wearing nightclothes. Colonel Raoul, roused from his bed by the sound of cannon fire, rushed to organize resistance while still in his nightshirt. The Hessian regiment attempted to form battle lines in the town square, but American marksmen from Virginia and Pennsylvania, positioned behind houses and fences, picked off officers and sergeants with deadly precision. European military doctrine had not prepared the Hessians for this style of warfare, where every building became a fortress and every fence line concealed death. General Sullivan's column swept into Trenton from the west, capturing the bridge over a Sunpink Creek and cutting off the primary escape route. His Rhode Island and Connecticut regiments moved with surprising speed despite their exhaustion. surrounding entire companies of Hessians before they could organize effective resistance. The careful coordination between Greene's and Sullivan's forces demonstrated that the Continental Army had learned valuable lessons from earlier defeats, as referenced in the comprehensive accounts found in the Pennsylvania Magazine of History and Biography. Captain William Washington and Lieutenant James Monroe led a daring charge to capture two Hessian cannons that threatened to break the American encirclement. Both officers were wounded in the assault, Monroe taking a musket ball in his shoulder that severed an artery. But their bold action eliminated the most serious threat to American success. The battle's turning point came when Colonel Rowell himself fell mortally wounded while attempting to rally his troops near the Trenton Presbyterian Church. With their commander down and their ranks devastated by American artillery fire, Hessian resistance began to crumble. Small groups of soldiers attempted to flee across the Assunpink Creek, but Sullivan's men had already secured the crossing points. Private Joseph White of Massachusetts later recalled the moment when victory became certain. The Hessians threw down their arms and begged for quarter in whatever English they could manage. Many wept openly, not from cowardice, but from the shock of being defeated by men they had been told were mere farmers and shopkeepers. Within 90 minutes, the battle was over. American casualties were remarkably light. 2 officers wounded, 2 soldiers frozen to death during the march, and perhaps a dozen men suffering from frostbite. The Hessian losses were devastating: 22 killed, 83 wounded, and nearly 900 captured. Equally important were the military supplies seized: 6 cannons, and enough muskets and ammunition to equip several Continental Army regiments. Washington surveyed the battlefield with grim satisfaction. The victory at Trenton had achieved its primary objective, proving that American forces could defeat professional European soldiers when properly led and motivated. More importantly, news of the triumph would spread throughout the colonies, rekindling hope that independence remained achievable. But the general knew that one victory, however dramatic, would not win the war. The British would respond with overwhelming force, and the Continental Army would need another miracle to survive the coming counterattack. News of the disaster at Trenton reached British headquarters in New York like a thunderclap on a clear day. General William Howe, commander of His Majesty's forces in North America, stared at the dispatch with disbelief before erupting into a fury that his staff had rarely witnessed. The rebels, whom he had dismissed as a rabble of farmers and merchants, had humiliated professional European soldiers and captured nearly 1,000 Hessian troops. The political ramifications would echo from New York to London. Lord Cornwallis, who had been preparing to sail for England on leave, immediately canceled his departure. The British High Command recognized that Washington's victory had transformed a dying rebellion into a renewed threat that demanded immediate and overwhelming response. Within 48 hours, Cornwallis was assembling a force of 8,000 British and Hessian troops to crush the Continental Army once and for all. The speed of the British. Its reaction caught many American leaders off guard. Washington had hoped for several weeks to recruit new soldiers and reorganize his forces, but Cornwallis was already marching south from New York with the largest army Britain had yet assembled in North America. The race was on. Could Washington build upon his victory at Trenton before superior British forces destroyed his army completely? Private Elisha Bostwick of the 7th Connecticut Regiment later described the Army's mood in the days following Trenton. The men walked taller and spoke with confidence they had not shown since the dark days of our retreat. We all knew the British would come for us, and when they did, we would face odds that would test even our newfound courage. Washington used the brief respite to address his army's most pressing need: soldiers. On December 30th, with many enlistments set to expire at midnight, the general made a personal appeal to his troops. Standing on a wooden box in front of his assembled forces, he offered a $10 bounty to any man who would extend his service for 6 additional weeks. More importantly, he spoke directly to their hearts about the cause for which they fought. "My brave fellows," Washington declared, "you have done all I asked you to do, and more than could be reasonably expected. But your country is at stake, your wives, your houses, and all that you hold dear. "You have worn yourselves out, but we know not how to spare you." The response was overwhelming. Nearly all of the soldiers stepped forward, agreeing to continue their service despite hunger, cold, and the certainty of facing superior enemy forces. Reinforcements began arriving from Pennsylvania and New Jersey. Militia units, swelling Washington's army to approximately 5,000 men. However, these new recruits lacked the experience and training of Continental Army regulars, and many carried outdated muskets or hunting rifles unsuitable for military formations. Washington knew that his expanded force, while numerically impressive, remained vulnerable to well-coordinated British attacks. Intelligence reports painted an increasingly dire picture of British preparations. Cornwallis had stripped garrisons throughout New York and New Jersey to assemble his expeditionary force, bringing together crack regiments that had served with distinction in European conflicts. The 42nd Highland Regiment, known as the Black Watch, would provide assault troops renowned for their fierce fighting ability, while artillery units equipped with modern cannons would support the infantry advance, as noted in scholarly research published by the Journal of the American Revolution. British strategy was elegantly simple: trap Washington's army against the Delaware River and destroy it through overwhelming firepower and superior numbers. Cornwallis planned to advance rapidly to Trenton, pin the Americans in defensive positions, and then launch coordinated attacks that would shatter Continental Army resistance within hours. Washington faced an impossible strategic situation: retreat across the Delaware would abandon New Jersey to British control and likely end the Revolution's momentum gained at Trenton. Standing and fighting at Trenton would expose his army to destruction by superior forces in a conventional battle. The general needed a third option, something so unexpected that even experienced British commanders would be caught off guard. That option began to form in Washington's mind as he studied maps of central New Jersey with his staff officers. Princeton, located 12 miles northeast of Trenton, housed a smaller British garrison, but offered significant strategic advantages. If the Continental Army could somehow reach Princeton undetected, it might strike another demoralizing blow against British forces while avoiding the trap Cornwallis was preparing at Trenton. On January 1st, 1777, Lord Cornwallis advanced toward Trenton with the confidence of a hunter closing in on wounded prey. His 8,000 troops moved with the mechanical precision that had made the British Army feared throughout Europe, their scarlet uniforms bright against the winter landscape. Behind them rolled artillery trains that could reduce any defensive position to rubble within hours. The rebellion, Cornwallis believed, would end before the week was over. Washington, meanwhile, orchestrated one of military history's most audacious deceptions. Throughout December 31st and January 1st, he positioned troops along the south bank of Assunpink Creek, creating the impression that the Continental Army intended to make its final stand at Trenton. Campfires blazed throughout the night, and American sentries made certain that British patrols observed their positions. Every detail suggested that Washington had chosen to fight with his back to the Delaware River. The British advance reached Trenton's outskirts by afternoon on January 2nd. Cornwallis, observing American positions across the creek, smiled with satisfaction. The rebels had made exactly the tactical error he had hoped for. They had trapped themselves in an indefensible position with no viable escape route. At last, "We have run down the old fox," he declared to his staff officers, "and we will bag him in the morning." Preliminary skirmishes erupted as British light infantry probed American defenses. Captain Thomas Forrest's artillery battery, the same guns that had thundered through Trenton streets a week earlier, replied with devastating accuracy. British casualties mounted as they attempted to force crossings at several points along Assunpink Creek. But Washington's men held firm, adding credibility to the deception that this would be the battle's primary theater. As darkness fell, British forces settled into positions around Trenton, confident that dawn would bring the Revolution's final chapter. Cornwallis retired to his headquarters, planning the coordinated assault that would crush American resistance within hours. His officers shared their commander's optimism, toasting the certain victory that awaited them with the sunrise. But in the American camp, a different drama was unfolding. As British sentries observed campfires burning brightly across a sun-pink creek, Washington was implementing the most daring military maneuver of his career. Beginning at midnight, Continental Army units began quietly abandoning their positions, leaving only skeleton crews to maintain the fires and create the illusion of a full encampment. The main army moved northeast, along back roads that local guides had scouted during the previous days. Wheels were wrapped in cloth to muffle sound, and strict silence was maintained as nearly 5,000 men crept through the darkness toward Princeton. The route avoided main highways where British patrols might detect the movement instead. Following farm paths and woodland tracks that added miles to the march but provided concealment, Colonel John Fitzgerald, Washington's aide-de-camp, later wrote of this night march, "Never have I witnessed such determination among soldiers who had every reason to despair. They understood that failure meant not only their own destruction, but the death of American independence itself. Yet they moved with the quiet confidence of men who had already achieved the impossible once and were prepared to do so again." As recorded in the detailed military histories housed at the Morristown National Historical Park, Washington's route took his army through Sandtown and Quaker Bridge, avoiding the direct roads that British intelligence would expect him to use. Local militia members, familiar with every path and stream in the region, served as guides while Continental Army engineers cleared obstacles that might slow the advance. The weather, which had been the Americans' enemy during the Delaware crossing, now became their ally. A sudden cold snap froze the muddy roads, allowing artillery and supply wagons to move quietly over ground that would have mired them in softer conditions. By dawn, Washington's army had covered 12 miles and was approaching Princeton from an unexpected direction. While Cornwallis remained convinced that his prey was still trapped at Trenton, the success of this maneuver depended entirely on maintaining the deception until the last possible moment. Small groups of Continental soldiers remained at a sun-pink creek, keeping fires burning and occasionally calling out challenges to create the impression of normal military activity. These brave men knew they faced capture or death when the British discovered the ruse. But their sacrifice would give Washington's main force the precious hours needed to reach Princeton undetected. Dawn on January 3rd, 1777, found Washington's army approaching Princeton through frost-covered fields, their breath forming clouds in the bitter air. The general rode with his advance guard, scanning the horizon for signs of British activity while privately marveling that his audacious night march had succeeded. Behind him, nearly 5,000 Continental soldiers moved with the quiet determination of men who understood they were writing history with their footsteps. Princeton presented a more complex tactical challenge than Trenton had offered a week earlier. The British garrison, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mohood, consisted of seasoned regulars from the 17th and 40th Foot Regiments, professional soldiers who would not be surprised as easily as the Hessians had been. Moreover, Princeton's strategic location meant that British reinforcements could arrive quickly from nearby garrisons if the attack became prolonged. The town itself sprawled across rolling hills, dotted with substantial stone buildings, including Nassau Hall, the imposing structure that housed the College of New Jersey. These buildings could serve as fortresses if the British chose to make a determined stand, turning what Washington hoped would be a swift victory into a costly siege. Time remained the Continental Army's most precious resource, as Cornwallis would soon discover the deception at Trenton and begin pursuing with overwhelming force. General Hugh Mercer's brigade formed the American advance guard, approaching Princeton. Along the post road while Washington prepared to deploy his main force, Mercer, a Scottish-born physician turned soldier, had served with distinction in previous campaigns and commanded some of the Continental Army's most reliable troops. His mission was to secure the bridge over Stony Brook and prevent British forces from escaping toward New Brunswick. Fate intervened when Mercer's column encountered 2 British regiments under Lieutenant Colonel Mahood, who was marching toward Trenton to reinforce Cornwallis. Neither commander expected to find enemy forces in this location. The resulting collision would determine Princeton's outcome. The engagement began in an orchard near the Thomas Clark farmhouse, where disciplined British volleys initially overwhelmed Mercer's surprised troops. General Mercer fell mortally wounded in the opening minutes, struck down by British bayonets. As he attempted to rally his men, his loss might have shattered American morale, but Washington himself galloped into the melee, his presence transforming panic into renewed determination. "Parade with us, my brave fellows." Drawing his sword as he rode directly between the opposing forces, "There is but a handful of the enemy, and we will have them directly," as documented in Joseph Reed's contemporary account, later preserved in the Pennsylvania Historical Society's archives. Washington's personal intervention at this crucial moment exemplified the leadership that made him indispensable to the American cause. Lesser commanders might have directed the battle from safety, but Washington understood that his soldiers needed to see their general sharing their dangers. Captain Alexander Hamilton's battery unlimbered on rising ground overlooking the battlefield, sending cannonballs crashing into British formations that were attempting to maintain their cohesion. The 18-year-old artillery officer, would later become the first Secretary of the Treasury, demonstrated the tactical brilliance that would mark his entire career by positioning his guns to maximum advantage despite the chaotic conditions. British resistance crumbled as American reinforcements swept onto the field. The 40th Foot Regiment, caught between Hamilton's artillery and advancing Continental infantry, attempted to retreat in good order, but found their escape route blocked by American troops who had flanked their position. Lieutenant Colonel Mahood, recognizing that his situation was hopeless, ordered his surviving men to break contact and flee toward New Brunswick. The battle's climax occurred when American forces stormed Nassau Hall, where British soldiers had taken refuge after their formations collapsed. Captain Alexander Hamilton personally directed cannon fire at the building's walls. While infantry units surrounded the structure to prevent escape, the zim was profound. American rebels were literally bombarding the halls of higher learning, transforming an academic institution into a battlefield where independence would be won or lost. Within 2 hours, Princeton belonged to the Continental Army. British casualties were severe, perhaps 100 killed, wounded, or captured, including many officers whose loss would be difficult to replace. American losses were also significant, particularly the death of General Mercer, whose leadership had been crucial to the Army's recent successes. But the strategic victory was undeniable. Washington had struck 2 devastating blows against British forces within a week, proving that the Continental Army remained a formidable opponent. The sound of cannon fire echoing across Princeton's snow-covered fields on January 3, 1777, carried far beyond the immediate battlefield. In Philadelphia, members of the Continental Congress looked up from their deliberations as the distant thunder reached their ears. In London, King George III would soon learn that his professional armies had suffered another humiliating defeat at the hands of colonial rebels. But nowhere did those gunshots resonate more powerfully than in the hearts of ordinary Americans who had begun to believe their cause was lost. Washington surveyed the captured British standards and artillery pieces scattered across Princeton's streets, his weathered face showing both satisfaction and concern. The tactical victory was complete, but strategic challenges remained formidable. Lord Cornwallis, upon discovering the deception at Trenton, would pursue with overwhelming force, seeking to trap the Continental Army before it could consolidate its gains. The general ordered an immediate withdrawal toward Morristown, where mountainous terrain would provide natural defensive advantages. The Continental Army's retreat from Princeton demonstrated the discipline that weeks of hardship had forged among Washington's men. Despite their exhaustion, soldiers moved with purpose, carrying wounded comrades and captured supplies while maintaining formation under pressure. The British pursuit, when it began, found only empty buildings and cold campfires. Evidence of an army that had learned to appear and vanish like morning mist. Captain Thomas Rodney of the Delaware Militia later wrote of the Army's mood during this withdrawal: "Though we were tired beyond measure and knew the British would come after us with greater numbers than ever, every man walked with his head high. We had proven ourselves against the best soldiers Europe could send against us, and that knowledge made us feel invincible despite our circumstances." The strategic consequences of Princeton extended far beyond military considerations. Throughout the colonies, Newspapers proclaimed Washington's victories with headlines that restored flagging morale and renewed commitment to independence. Recruitment offices that had stood empty for months suddenly found themselves overwhelmed with volunteers eager to serve under the general who had humiliated British forces twice within a week. French observers in Philadelphia began reassessing American prospects with new interest. The victories at Trenton and Princeton demonstrated that the Continental Army possessed staying power and tactical competence that earlier defeats had seemed to contradict. These demonstrations would prove crucial in eventual French decisions to provide military assistance that would prove decisive in achieving American independence. British strategic planning required complete revision in light of Washington's successes. The comfortable assumption that rebel forces could be easily defeated through conventional military pressure had been shattered. General Howe began concentrating his scattered garrisons into more defensible positions, abandoning much of New Jersey to American control and effectively acknowledging that the rebellion remained far. As referenced in the comprehensive analysis published by the American Historical Review, Washington's Princeton campaign represented a masterpiece of military improvisation under impossible circumstances, with inferior numbers, inadequate supplies, and troops whose enlistments were expiring. The general had outmaneuvered professional opponents and achieved victories that changed the war's entire trajectory. The winter encampment at Morristown that followed Princeton became a symbol of American resilience. Despite continued hardships that would test the Continental Army's endurance throughout the harsh months ahead, morale remained high because soldiers had witnessed their own capacity for victory. They had crossed the Delaware in a blizzard, surprised professional soldiers at Trenton, deceived a superior enemy at Princeton, and lived to fight another day. Washington himself understood that Princeton marked a turning point, not just in military terms, but in the broader struggle for American independence. The victories had proven that citizen soldiers, properly led and motivated, could defeat the world's most powerful military force. More importantly, they had demonstrated that the American cause possessed the spiritual strength to survive its darkest moments and emerge with renewed determination. Years later, as President of the United States, Washington would look back on the Princeton campaign as the moment when independence transformed from a desperate dream into an achievable reality. The bold gamble that had begun with a frozen river crossing on Christmas night had culminated in proof that American liberty was worth any sacrifice. The revolution would continue for 6 more years, but Princeton had shown the world that the United States of America would not surrender its birthright without a fight that would echo through the ages. In the end, Princeton became more than a battlefield victory. It became a testament to the power of leadership, courage, and unwavering commitment to principles worth dying for. Washington's boldest move had indeed taken place at Princeton, where he proved that sometimes the most audacious gamble is the only path to salvation.